Right, part 2 then. I'll just get my screen back up. Here we go. So I've pre-highlighted this because obviously the approach to A Christmas Carol is identical to the approach to an In Spectacles. So I don't want to model the same thing twice too much. So if my question is about redemption, obviously as I'm reading through my extract, I need to make sure the quotations I'm selecting are about redemption. Obviously the exam board have selected a extract which is going to have multiple examples of whatever the question is about. Otherwise it would just be daft. So at this point, now I've highlighted my extract, I need to be selecting the quotes I'm going to use, and I need to be coming up with a really quick plan. What events from the extract and the wider text am I going to choose to use to talk about how Dickens presents redemption? And the hard bit, and I guess it's probably harder the better you know the book, because there's all sorts of different examples. From the extract, I am going to probably start with this quotation. If the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Scrooge basically asking the spirit that if he departs from the life that he once had, departs from his behaviour, can he change? Then I am probably going to do I am not the man I was. And then I'd probably, depending on how confident I felt as a student about talking about the Christian perspectives, i.e. the spirit of all three ghosts, which, you know, could represent the Christian Holy Trinity shall strive within me. I could pick that quote. I could pick, I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. I will honour Christmas in my heart. So I'm going to want to say something from this bit, because this is essentially showing Scrooge's redemption. He is now going to learn the lessons that the ghosts or God have given him, live every day as if it was Christmas, and never shut out the lessons that they teach. So those would probably be my 3 quotes, although I'd want to write about a lot more. So I want to roughly say something about most staves. You might not remember stave is just think of stave as another word for chapter in this. I'm not going to be able to write about everything in every stave though, so I've got to be selective. So I'm going to want to write about stave 1, and I'm going to want to write about stave 1 showing that Scrooge is in desperate need of redemption. So I'm going to look at the opening description of Scrooge. I might do solitary as an oyster. I'm going to want to talk about treatment of Bob. And I might talk about his one lump of coal. Not sure if that's sorry, that's supposed to be coal. Trying to do this quickly. Don't think that's a particular quotation, but there we go. I'm going to want to talk about rejection of charity workers. And then he talks about the poor as surplus population. And ideally, I'm going to want to make reference to Jacob Marley. Yeah, who says, I wear the chains I forged in life. Now, I might find that's an awful lot to reference. But if I'm making lots of little references, so if I did a sentence or 2 on each of those from stave 1, maybe I could fit them all in. Or I might have to be selective and only maybe write about the opening description of Scrooge and Jacob Marley. Like I said, I think this is what I would struggle with in the exam, is actually not having time to write about so much. Stave 2, I could talk about Scrooge as a child. His dodgy relationship with his father. Father is so much kinder than he was. But for each of the different things I'm going to do from stave 2, 3, and 4, I want to explain or show my examiner I have the knowledge of how this event causes Scrooge to be redeemed. So being reminded of his lonely childhood, his lack of love, how does that cause Scrooge's redemption? I could potentially write about Fezziwig, makes him regret treatment of Bob. I might talk about Belle, the fact that he chooses money over love. How does seeing these events teach Scrooge the error of his ways? Stave 3, I could talk about the Cratchits and Tiny Tim. And when he asks if Tiny Tim will live with an interest never felt before. He's never cared about some random poor child before. I might talk about Fred's party. Yeah, learning importance of family. And finally, I might talk about ignorance and wants. Yeah, because it's not just about Scrooge. If mankind don't change and be redeemed collectively, they will be doomed. So those are some potential things. Again, I'm very well might need to be selective. I couldn't necessarily write about all of this. Then I've got stave 4. I could write about old Joe and Mrs. Dilber and the other characters. Remember, there's the other unnamed characters. Steal Scrooge's belongings. You know, I would want to talk about, again, this is showing him that because he treated people so badly and had such a horrendous reputation, no one is respecting him in death, essentially, you know. No one cares he's dead. You know, body left alone, unwept, uncared for, we're told. You know, there's not Fred or a wife or children or grandchildren weeping over his body. He's completely alone. And finally, I might talk about Tiny Tim's death. You know, how does that really make Scrooge realise he's got to change? He's got to save Tiny Tim's life. Then obviously stave 5 is all going to be about Scrooge is redeemed. Yeah? How he says things like, I'm light as a feather. It's like a weight has been lifted on him. Yeah, the anonymous donation of turkey to Cratchits. Yeah, gives money to charity workers. Goes to Fred's party. Raises Bob's salary and becomes a second father Now, obviously, that's taken me way more than a couple of minutes that you would do in the exam, and I am not suggesting that your plan needs to be nearly a page. And there's no way. I mean, if you gave me 45 minutes, I don't think I could do all of this justice and then also fit in the extract. So I'd want to put my extract would come here, wouldn't it? So I would have to select maybe, you know, for those of you who are quite slow writers, that your biggest issue is you don't necessarily write enough. You might find you only want to write about one event from each stave. Remember, depending on the question, you might not have something relevant from every stave. again, it's hard to predict exactly what the questions will be, but depending on what the question is, it might not necessarily mean there's something from every stage for you to write about. But if it's this sort of question, you know, redemption, obviously there is an awful lot there. So there has to be a level of selection before you start writing, because you don't want, if I started to try and write this, I'd probably get about here before I'd run out of time. And what I'm doing there is I'm not showing the fact that I know how this story ends, simply because I've planned to write about too much. So you must go into this exam with a really clear idea of how much generally can you write, how many references have you made successfully in the past, and when it comes down to your planning, make sure that you're bearing that in mind. Okay, so I might select one or two of each of these things when I'm doing my proper plan in the exam, knowing I've got to slot in my 3 quotes wherever they appear. I'm not going to bother modelling this out to you because it's exactly the same as what I've just modelled for an inspector course. The only thing I would say, I've got to make sure I am writing about context. Okay, I've got to make sure that I'm writing about Dickens' experiences of poverty as a child in the blackening factory when his dad went into debtor's prison. I've got to make sure I'm writing about all of the Christian views at the time and how Dickens believed a lot of Victorian Christians were hypocrites because they didn't actually care about the poor like Jesus did. I'm going to want to write about the 1834 Poor Law and the creation of the workhouses and the debtors' prisons, which wasn't done because the government cared about the poor. It was done because they wanted to deal with basically sweep the poor away, put them somewhere else. So, you know, no one had to really think or look at them. And Dickens thought these things were really, really wrong. You know, the fact that the rich thought the poor were just ignorant, lazy, immoral people, and that the entire purpose of this book is to teach people a moral lesson to make them better Christians, to open their hearts up to the poor and be more charitable. I need to show my awareness of that throughout. Okay, and you absolutely need to revise the context and put that context in as much as you can. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this, and then we're going to do a little bit of work on unseen poetry finally. So remember, by this point you would have written about an inspector course for 45 minutes. You would have written about A Christmas Carol for 45 minutes. But unfortunately for you, it's not over. You do still actually have a whole hour left, I'm afraid, to write about the unseen poetry. Now, in many ways, the unseen poetry should be the most straightforward part of this exam, because actually it's not something that you have to pre-remember. It's not like trying to get a book or, you know, the anthology poems from the last paper in your head. You will have copies of both poems. They'll tell you what the poems are about. You've just got to know how to approach it and be confident enough to not be scared by poetry. Okay, so you'll have 1 hour to answer 2 questions. Both poems will be about the same topic, and it will tell you, as you'll see in a minute, what the poems are about when I show you a sample paper. Question 1 will always be write about whatever the title of the poem is and its effect on you. So you can write about anything you like about that poem, but you need to focus in on the effect. What's the effect of the language? That's worth 15 marks, and you should spend about 20 minutes on it. The second question is always write about, now compare the second poem, whatever the title of the second poem is, to the title of the first poem you've just written. It doesn't even tell you what to compare. You can compare anything you like, okay? But a sensible thing to do is to compare the effect. This question is fundamentally all about your ability to read a poem, to interpret and understand it, and to be able to justify your interpretation and your understanding through analysing the effect of language. Question 2 is then looking at how you can make connections and comparisons between those poems. So how do we approach question 1 then? And I'm going to briefly model this for you in a moment. We need to read what the two poems are about in the exam question, and it will very clearly tell you. We need to read the title of the first poem because it might give us some important information. It doesn't always, but it's worth having a look. I need to then read the first poem, and as I'm going, I need to highlight language that has an effect on me. When I've done that first reading, I need to think, well, okay, what effect does this poem have on me? Is it leaving me with a feeling of sadness? Is it leaving me with a feeling of happiness? Is it leaving me with a feeling of optimism or horror? And you might find that the mood of the poem shifts and changes. Sometimes a poem starts off happy and ends sad. Sometimes it starts off sad and ends happy. Sometimes the mood starts off sad and gets even sadder by the end. So it is worth giving yourself that little moment to reflect once you've read that poem for the first time. Well, what is this poem having on me? If I know that this poem is about teachers and the way people view teachers, what generally am I getting from this poem about how this person views teachers, for example? What you want to do is really think, what are some key quotations that I could analyse confidently about the effect? Once I've then highlighted and selected around 4 to 5 quotations, I then am ready to write. Now, this is taken just from a PowerPoint I did looking at a past paper where the poems were about people's reactions to being at home. So you can say here that we've got a sentence starter for your overview. Home, or whatever the title of the poem is, has a positive, negative, optimistic, joyful effect on me because. Briefly summarize the effect. At the start of the poem, when we are told quotation, it has a whatever effect it has on me because, and I'm going to analyze the effect of the language. Further on, when we are told, quote, it has a whatever effect on me because. And you can see, just like the Romeo and Juliet extract question, just like the anthology poetry question 1, we are simply tracking through that poem from start to finish, analysing the effect of the words. And you can see by starting our sentences with words like further on, next, additionally, finally, it just gives a nice coherence and flow to your answer. So once you've done that, then you're moving on to question 2. I need to now read the second poem, and I need to now think, okay, once I've read that second poem, does it have a similar effect? Does it have a different effect? Or is it a bit of both? Is it presenting whatever they're about, teachers? Is it presenting it in a different way, a similar way, or a bit of both? I've then got to probably read it for a second time, and I want to highlight any words that have an effect on me, but I want to be clever here and be thinking, I need to highlight quotes that I can link back to that first poem. Now, that link might be a similarity, that link might be a different. It really doesn't matter. It could be all similarities, all differences, doesn't matter. Bits of both. But I do need to be sensible about the quotations I'm picking from that second poem, because of course I need to then look at my first poem and I need to pair those quotations together. So for each comparative paragraph, I'm going to be writing about a quote from question 2, and I'm going to be comparing its effect to a quote from question 1. So before you start writing, you must have 3 pairs of quotes. Okay, 1 from each poem, 3 pairs. Some of you might be able to do 4 pairs, those of you that are a lot quicker at your thinking and writing, okay? Then, once I've done that and I've planned that out, I can then look at my second question. So again, this is taken from that previous exam paper. Coming home has a whatever effect on me because. This is similar or different to the effect home had on me because. So I want to summarise the effect that the second poem has on me. I want to then state whether it's similar or different to the first poem and why. Then I simply need to flip between my 2 poems. So in Coming Home, when we are told, quote, it has a whatever effect on me because, analysing the effect of the language. I've then got to add that to a second PE, Similarly, if I'm making a similarity, or in contrast to this, if I'm doing a difference, in home, when we are told whatever our quotation, it has a similar effect or a different effect on me because, and then I'm analysing the language. So you can see here, I'm simply going backwards and forwards between the two poems. I'm writing about something from question 2, I'm analysing the effect of the language, then I'm going back to question 1. Does this quote from question 1 that I'm now writing about have a similar or different effect on me because? And I'm just going backwards and forwards between those two poems. Ideally, I'm able to do that 3 times. So what does that look like in practice then? I'm going to switch back to the visualizer. There we go. Apologies for the slightly dodgy copy of this. The photocopier downstairs is not loving life at the moment. So let me just zoom in a little bit. Section C, unseen poetry. Answer both 3.1 and 3.2. You are advised to spend about 20 minutes on the first question and 40 minutes on the second. Read the 2 poems, The Newcomer by Brian Patton and The Fisher All Sick by Anne Stevenson. Both poems describe the effect humans have on the environment and that natural world. So here we go. It will always tell you what the poems are about. These poems are about the effect humans are having on the environment and the natural world, okay? Write about the poem, The Newcomer by Brian Patton, and its effect on you. You may wish to consider what the poem is about, how it's organised, the ideas the poet may have wanted us to think about, poet's choice of words, phrases, images, and the effects they have, and how you respond to the poem. Now, this is essentially, if you follow what I've advised you, you'll be doing all of these things. But they give you these bullet points to give you a little bit of a support or a scaffold to remind you of the sorts of things you should be included. Okay, The Newcomer. So I know it's a poem about environmentalism. I might be thinking here, the newcomer. Maybe this is something that hasn't happened before. Okay, so there's this idea of newness. There's something new in the river, the fish said as it swam. It's got no scales, no fins or no gills, and ignores the impassable dam. There's something new in the trees, I heard the bloated thrush sing. It's got no beak, no claws, and no feathers, and not even the ghost of a wing. There's something new in the warren, said the rabbit to the doe. It's got no fur, no eyes, and no paws, yet digs further than we dare to go. There's something new in the whiteness, said the snow-white polar bear. I saw its shadow on the glacier, but it left no paw marks there. Through the animal kingdom, the news was spreading fast. No beak, no claws, no feather, no scales, no fur, no gills. It lives in the trees and the water, and in the soil and the snow and the hills. And it kills, and it kills, and it kills. Now, I haven't ever read this poem before, actually. I found a paper that I haven't done and never seen. So this is actually legitimately unseen to me too, which is helpful. The first thing that I notice is that the rhythm and the rhyme changes. Okay. Now, for those of you aiming at the top grades, the 7s and above, being able and confident enough to write about rhythm, rhyme, form, structure, if you can make meaningful comments on its effects, that's always helpful for accessing the higher marks. But I've really noticed here that in this final stanza, it becomes a lot more obviously negative about the effect pollution, which is clearly what this entire poem is about. You know, the pollution and the environmental damage that humans are doing to the natural world. You know, we break the rhyme scheme here. And rather than be A, B, so we've got sort of there and there for dough and go. We've then got this rhyming couplet. In the soil and the snow and the hills, and it kills, and it kills, and it kills. That's quite interesting. So you can see here what I've highlighted, and what I would have to do is I would have to think, okay, 3 or 4 quotations that I could use about the effect this poem has on me. I'm also going to want to be thinking, what effect does this poem have on me? It's a really negative effect. It's depressing, but it also makes me very worried. As a person who already worries quite a lot about climate change anyway, this poem makes me feel really sad, a little bit angry that we as a species are so stupid to keep doing this to our planet, and also makes me just sad. So I'm spending that time to reflect on the effect this poem's having on me. Now I've got to really think, what are 3 or 4 really good quotations where I could really analyse the effect? So I'm going to probably start here because I want to start at the start. This idea of it being unnatural, no scales, no fins, no gills. Then I like this idea of the bloated thrush, because to me bloated means sort of like if you're bloated, that's unhealthy. Is that thrush unhealthily large because of environmental damage? It reminds me of a David Attenborough documentary where we saw all of these birds' stomachs filled with plastic, for example. Now, that might not have the same effect on you because you might not have watched that documentary. But again, the quotations you pick will be very personal to you. I'm then going to talk about shadow, because to me, thinking of light and dark imagery, I'm always banging on in A Christmas Carol, shadow to me is really having that really negative effect, this idea of this pollution, this environmental damage is evil. And then I'm going to end with it kills and it kills and it kills. So what I'd now want to do is start with my overview. I'd want to briefly summarize what effect does this poem have on me? And then I'm, at the start of the poem, when we are told that this pollution has no scales, no fins, no gills, it's having a depressing effect on me because it is showing that this pollution is unnatural, etc., etc. Further on, when the thrush is described as bloated, it has a worrying effect on me because the word bloated makes me imagine this bird has potentially got a stomach filled with plastic. Reminds me of a documentary I saw showing that these birds were dying of starvation because of the plastic in their stomachs. This makes me feel that this is really morally wrong, etc., etc., etc. Then I'm moving on. Further on, when this pollution is described as a shadow, it has a negative effect on me because the word shadow makes me think of evil, etc. Finally, the repetition in the final line, it kills, it kills, it kills, is very effective and has a strong effect on me because, and then I'm done. Okay. So then I need to move on to question 3. Now compare The Fish Are All Sick by Anne Stevenson and The Newcomer by Brian Patton. I should compare what they're about and how they're organised, the ideas the poet may have wanted us to think about, compare the poet's choice of words, phrases, images and effects, and compare how I respond. So it's pretty much exactly the same bullet points as the previous question. We've just got this word compare. Remember, compare means similarities and differences. Oh, this is quite a short little poem. Again, never read this poem before either. So I want to read it. I want to highlight words that have an effect on me, but then I need to automatically be thinking, does this poem have a similar or a different effect? The fish are all sick is obviously is telling me that this is going to be another probably quite negative, worrying poem like the last poem. So I'm sort of expecting them to have maybe quite a similar effect on me. The fish are all sick, the great whales are dead, the villages stranded in stone on the coast, ornamental like pearls on the fringe of a coat. Seamen who knew what the ocean did turned their low houses away from the surf, but new men who come to be rural and safe add big glass views and begonia beds. Water keeps to itself. White lip after lip curls to a close on the littered beach. Something is sicker and blacker than fish, and closing its grip and closing its grip. Okay, fundamentally, this poem is doing exactly the same thing. It is making me feel angry, worried, anxious, scared. Because we are, as a species, systematically destroying our planet. So there's lots and lots of similarities. However, I would say this poem does this in a slightly more explicit or obvious way. For example, the fish are sick and the great whales are dead. That's a little bit different to the start of the poem, where it's a little bit more subtle. But generally the effect is the same. What this one does that's different is it doesn't just talk about the animals, it also talks about the people, which is quite an interesting difference. Talks about the fact that environmental damage and climate change has left villages stranded and destroyed, maybe because of rising sea levels, maybe because most people have had to move from these villages because the land's no longer farmable. I love this idea about, you know, men that knew the sea, knew what the ocean did, maybe people that used to fish responsibly and respect nature in sort of the past. They now no longer live in these countrysides. These people, you know, maybe these fishermen have had to abandon their trades, their jobs that's maybe been passed down in their families for years, maybe just go work in the cities. Meanwhile, new men have come. Oh, I want to move away from the pollution-riddled cities where it's safe. But actually, all I do is destroy nature by building these giant, monstrous houses. So there's a real irony there. Again, that's quite a difference from the first poem because there's some very obvious criticism of people. Then we've got this idea of the littered beach. I would probably link that very obviously to the bloated thrush. So my brain is already making connections there. And again, something is sicker and blacker than fish. That's making me think of the shadow. We have that sort of dark imagery. And then closing its grip, closing its grip. We then have that similarity to that sort of repetition, and it kills and it kills and it kills. So there's a lot of similarities and differences here. What I would need to do is I would need to pick quotations I can link back to the first poem. Now, what people always ask me here in the classroom, can we use the same quotes twice? If I've picked the best quotes from poem 1, and I've now picked quotes from poem 2, but there's some really good comparisons to poem 1 using quotes I've already used, can I use those questions again, use those quotes again? Now, the answer is yes. However, you do want to make sure you are not only linking that quote really clearly to this second poem, you want to be showing you're not just doing exactly the same thing with that quote as you did for question 1. Now, you are going to have to say some similar things about it, but it's okay to use a quote you've already used for question 1 and question 2, as long as you are really making that link and that comparison clear when you're now writing about it again. For example, I can think of 2 quotes I've already used that I would want to use here. So I now need to think of pairs of quotes, and that's the final thing I'm going to sort of leave with you before we sort of end this video. So I'm going to probably want to link the ending of this poem to the ending here. So I'm going to look at, and it kills and it kills and it kills, and I'm going to link that to closing its grip, closing its grip. The reason I've done number 3 is that's going to be the last thing I write about because it's at the end of both poems. Now, for question 2, you do not have to track this chronologically. You don't have to do it from start to finish because you can't track both poems chronologically at the same time. It's impossible. I'm also going to do a difference, talking about the new men who come to be rural and safe. So I'm going to write about that. And then I'm going to link that to, let me think of a difference. I'm going to link that to digs further than we go, because I've got a difference there that this is talking particularly about the pollution and the negative effect the pollution's having, but this is talking about the negative effect the people are having. So number 1, I'm going to talk about the littered beach, and I'm going to talk about the bloated thrush. So my 3 pairs of quotes are bloated thrush and littered beech. It's a difference because we're talking about the effect on the environment and the effect on birds, but it's also a similarity because actually my interpretation of bloated thrush is that's a thrush filled with plastic. Where do these birds pick that plastic up? Through the littered beech. Then I'm going to talk about a difference. In poem 2, we've got the explicit criticism of the people that move to the countryside and destroy it. However, in poem 1, it's much more of a criticism of the environment, you know, that pollution digging further into the earth, into the sea, than we as people can do. Then I'm going to end with a similarity of the use of repetition at the end of the poems, really giving that sense of urgency and panic that actually if we don't do something soon to halt climate change, you know, to quote Dickens, we're doomed. So I hope by sort of verbalizing that and talking you through this, you can see how you would approach that. If you would then want to sort of go back and think, well, okay, how do I set that out? Just go back, you know, 10 odd minutes in this video to the PowerPoint I showed you where you saw the structure. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Please do feel free to email me any questions sort of over the weekend, any practices that you might, you know, do that you wanted me to sort of look over. I'm happy to give that feedback and that response. Just remember, it's about writing as much as you possibly can and doing your best, which is all you can fundamentally ask of yourself. Okay, good luck, guys, and I'll see you next week.